The Anglo-Zulu War of 1879, a conflict between the British Empire and the Zulu Kingdom in South Africa, involving extraordinary displays of bravery and strategy on both sides. Originally sparked by British imperial ambitions and disputes over land, the war featured battles such as the famous Zulu victory at Isandlwana, where a well-coordinated Zulu force overwhelmed the British. But of course, then we also have the heroic defense at Rorke's Drift, where a small band of British soldiers successfully repelled a massive Zulu assault. Now, despite early setbacks, the British eventually prevailed through superior technology and reinforcements, leading to the eventual defeat of the Zulu Kingdom. But regardless of the outcome, the Anglo-Zulu War remains a pretty captivating chapter of African history, showing their resistance and resilience, and it's inspired countless stories, films, and historical studies that continue to fascinate us, or at least me, and I guess perhaps you as well. You must be here for some reason. Well, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to do a little bit more colonial history, but we're going to tell the story of the great Anglo-Zulu War. Now, I have done a video on Rorke's Drift, and of course that sits within the context of all of this. And I will do a video too on Battle of Isandlwana, because that also requires quite a few more details. But since both of those battles exist within the context of the broader context of the war, we'll cover them briefly today. So, let's all get nice and comfortable. Oh yeah, like and subscribe if you want. Anyway, so we begin now in the 1850s, and this was certainly the height of British imperial attitudes, and the British Empire had maintained several colonies in southern Africa, colonies which bordered numerous indigenous territories and polities, including prominent African kingdoms such as the Zulus and the Basotho, alongside various Boer communities. Of course, everyone was taking a little slice out of Africa at that time. The poor old Africans had their borders completely withdrawn, with no real consideration to any tribal considerations, things like this. So we'll get to that in a different video about the scramble of Africa. So either way, in these encounters, Britain followed a pretty expansionist approach. After the Dutch settlement at Cape Town, which is, yes, of course, the modern-day Cape Town, was permanently transferred to British control under the Anglo-Dutch Treaty in 1814, the Cape Colony was established, and its domain grew substantially throughout the 19th century. Following the annexation of the Boer Republic of Natalia by the British government, the southeastern African region of Natal, which is now KwaZulu-Natal, was formally declared a British colony on May 4th, 1843. Hostilities intensified when three sons, led by Zulu Kasiyo, and including a brother of the Zulu Inkosi Sihayo, organized a raid into Natal, kidnapping two women who were under British protection. Of course, usually when things like this happen, they're generally used as a casus belli for some kind of military action and a further annexation or grab at resources. Well, we'll see how it all develops. We won't talk too much about that in the context of 1843. But we will move on to 1867, where they discovered something very interesting close to the Vaal River. What they discovered was diamonds. Now, the Vaal River location was roughly about 900 kilometers or 550 miles northeast of Cape Town, and this was an event that drastically influenced the region and ended the Boers' isolation in the interior. It triggered a worldwide rush. Just like all the other gold rushes did, diamonds were the new thing. It lured individuals from across the globe, and of course it spurred on the British imperial aspirations, propelling the rapid growth of Kimberley into a settlement of 50,000 inhabitants within a short space of 5 years. They could hardly keep up building the infrastructure, and things got a little bit messy. Well, throughout the 1870s, the British took control of West Griqualand, where significant diamonds were located. Then we have one of the main characters in the old British colonial story, Lord Carnarvon. You might have heard of him from a few of the other colonial history videos. The Secretary of State for the Colonies, who had pioneered Canadian Federation in 1867, believed that a comparable scheme could be implemented in South Africa by 1874. This plan envisioned governance by a small, albeit white minority, over a large black majority, providing ample inexpensive labor for British sugar plantations and mines. In 1875, Carnarvon tried to extend British authority by engaging with the Boer states of the Transvaal Republic, which is now kind of like near northeastern South Africa, this sort of area, and also the Orange Free State, which is now simply Free State Province, aiming to form a federation of British and Boer territories. However, the Boer leaders were not as keen on the idea as he was, and they declined the offer. In 1877, Lord Carnarvon selected Sir Bartle Frere to be High Commissioner for Southern Africa, with the agreement that Frere would enact Carnarvon's Confederation plan. In return, Frere was to become the first British governor of a unified Southern African dominion. Once in place, Frere moved swiftly to advance the scheme. Yet the independent Boer states, together with the Kingdom of Zululand and the South African Republic, widely referred to at the time as the Transvaal Republic or the Orange Free State, posed obstacles. Frere wasted no time in unveiling the plan and heightened the significance of certain recent occurrences to justify action against the Zulu. Also, in 1877, Sir Theophilus Shepstone, which is just a brilliant name, the British Secretary for Native Affairs in Natal, employed a special warrant to incorporate the Transvaal Republic into the British Empire. Of course, once again, the Transvaal Boers opposed the move, but since the Zulu threat was still present, they found themselves confronting dangers on both sides. Certainly a rock and a hard place. They feared that the King Cetshwayo and his Zulu forces might strike if they took up arms against the British annexation. For the Boer republics, the series of British territorial acquisitions, particularly the occupation of West Griqualand, intensified an undercurrent of disquiet. Shepstone openly attacked the destabilizing effect of allowing Cetshwayo's regime to persist. Zulu power, he declared, is the root and real strength of all native difficulties in South Africa. In December of 1877, he wrote to Carnarvon, I quote, "Cetshwayo is the secret hope of every petty independent chief hundreds of miles from him who feels a desire that his colour shall prevail. And it will not be until this hope is destroyed that they make up their minds to submit to the rule of civilization." Earlier, in October of 1877, Shepstone had attended talks with Zulu leaders near the Blood River, I wonder how it got that name, to resolve a lingering land dispute between the Boers and the Zulus, or at least one of them. The discussions in which he suggested a compromise for the Boers ended inconclusively. Soon afterwards, Shepstone turned decisively against the Zulus, insisting he had the most incontrovertible, overwhelming, and clear evidence supporting Boer claims, and labeling the Zulu arguments as characterized by lying and treachery to an extent that I could not have believed even savages are capable of. Good Lord. I mean, you can certainly tell whose side he's on, can't you? Well, a little bit of back to serious matters now. I can't help but just laugh at the statement. Well, in his capacity as the British governor of Natal, Theophilus Shepstone had long voiced concerns about the threat posed by King Cetshwayo's Zulu forces, particularly as the Zulus were armed with older firearms such as muskets. That's right, they weren't just running around with their traditional weapons. Believe me, they had weapons, perhaps not as modern, but they did have something, certainly better than the traditional methods, enough to put the British a little bit on edge. After assuming his new post as administrator of the Transvaal, encompassing parts of what is now Gauteng Limpopo, Shepstone assumed responsibility for safeguarding the Transvaal. From this vantage point, he became directly involved in the ongoing Zulu border issue, which was further complicated by Paul Kruger's diplomatic activities and repeated Boer petitions. Incidents of Zulu paramilitary actions, rather, on both the Natal and Transvaal sides of the border, led Shepstone to conclude that King Cetshwayo had adopted a defiant mood and permitted such outrages, as he put it. Apart from Bishop John Colenso of Natal, there was no one left in Natal who openly defended Cetshwayo. Colenso himself stood up for African communities in Zululand and Natal who experienced what he thought was unjust treatment by the colonial administration. In 1874, he appealed directly to the colonial secretary Lord Carnarvon on behalf of Langalibalale, if I'm saying that one right, sorry to him about that, as well as the Hlubi and Ngwe peoples. Wrongly charged with insurrection in 1873, Langalibalale received a guilty verdict and was exiled to Robben Island following a biased trial. One could imagine he was not going to get a fair shot at defending himself by having a proper lawyer. Well, by siding with Langalibalale instead of supporting Theophilus Shepstone and the colonial government, Colenso became further estranged from white colonial society in Natal. Because he was troubled by the misleading information that Shepstone and the Natal governor were transmitting to London's colonial office, Bishop Colenso actively supported the Zulus as they resisted the Boer domination and government encroachments. He even openly disagreed with Sir Bartle Frere's claims that the Zulu Kingdom posed an imminent danger to Natal. All this outspoken criticism, which revealed the racially biased foundations of the colonial regime in Natal, caused many colonists to regard him as, well, an adversary. It's probably the kindest word for it. I'm sure they had other words for him. Under Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, the Conservative government in London did not favour a war with the Zulus. As Sir Michael Hicks Beach, who succeeded Lord Carnarvon as Secretary of State of the Colonies, observed in November of 1878, "The fact is that matters in Eastern Europe and India were so serious an aspect that we cannot have a Zulu war in addition to another greater and two possible troubles." And yes, fair enough, India at that time, British India, the colonial state of that, was an absolute mess. Not good for them. Well, not good for anybody, really. Nevertheless, Sir Bartle Frere, who had served in the Cape Colony, today split into regions including Western and Eastern Cape, as Governor and High Commissioner since 1877, had already made substantial progress on his own agenda. Tasked with creating a confederation of South Africa from British colonies, Boer republics, and local African states, Frere found Shepstone's warnings of a powerful Zulu kingdom blocking regional stability to be persuasive. After months of planning a possible British incursion into Zulu territory, Frere, despite London's reluctance to initiate another colonial conflict, presented Cetshwayo with an ultimatum in December of 1878. The Zulu army had to be disbanded, and a British resident must be accepted. Of course, from the Zulu point of view, this demand was intolerable, as Cetshwayo would have effectively relinquished his throne by consenting. Of course, the Zulu Kingdom itself had been established decades earlier by its first monarch, Shaka Zulu, who transformed a modest tribal community into a pretty formidable power through conquest and warfare. Should probably do a little video on him soon, shouldn't I? Maybe just 10 hours of Zulu history, that would be nice. Well, by 1825 at least, Shaka's domain covered some 11,500 square miles. And that's pretty good. In 1828, he was unfortunately assassinated by at Dukuza, by two of his half-brothers, among them Dingane, who succeeded him, and one of his indunas, their word for counselors. During the 1830s, while Dingane reigned, the Zulu Kingdom came into conflict with the migrating Boer settlers. On December 16th, 1838, Dingane's forces suffered a decisive defeat at the Battle of Blood River against 470 Voortrekkers, led by Andres Pretorius. Soon thereafter, Dingane's half-brother, Mpande, along with about 17,000 followers, actually sided with the Boers to fight Dingane, who was ultimately killed. Mpande then ascended the throne of the Zulu Kingdom. So, under the leadership of Pretorius, the Boer Voortrekkers established the Boer Republic of Natalia in 1839 on territory situated west of the British outport at Port Natal, modern-day Durban, and south of the Tugela River. Mpande and Pretorius maintained cordial relationships, at least initially. However, once hostilities arose between the British and the Boers, the British annexed Natalia in 1842. After shifting his allegiance, Mpande continued to enjoy friendly relations with the British. In 1843, Mpande ordered a purge of individuals that he deemed as dissidents within his domain. Perhaps political rivals, too. May as well throw a few of them in there for good measure. This, of course, resulted in numerous fatalities and drove thousands of refugees into neighboring areas, including the British-controlled Natal. Many of these fleeing people brought along cattle, an essential measure of Zulu wealth. Subsequently, Mpande embarked on raids into the region, culminating in the 1852 invasion of Swaziland, which is modern-day Eswatini. Under British pressure, he soon withdrew. Around this time, Mpande's sons, Cetshwayo and Umbayazi, became locked in a battle for succession, culminating in the 1856 Battle of Dondakusuka, during which Umbayazi was killed. Therefore, Cetshwayo began supplanting his father's authority, and that's pretty much how he got into power. Because in 1872, following Mpande's death from old age, Cetshwayo just walked right into the role. Made for it. Born for it. Maybe. So, He assembled a large armed contingent near the border in 1861, spurred by the flight of another of Mbande's sons, Umtonga, into the Utrecht district. Boer accounts claim Cetshwayo promised local farmers a band of territory along the frontier in return for handing over his brother. Once Umtonga's life was guaranteed, the Boers consented, and Mbande signed a deed in 1861 granting that parcel of land to the Boers. The newly included Utrecht area featured a southern boundary stretching from a specific point on the Pongola River to Rorke's Drift on the Buffalo River. When Umtonga escaped from Zululand and Natal again in 1865, Cetshwayo realized that he had effectively lost his side of the arrangement. He feared Umtonga, still alive, might actually be manipulated to replace him, just as Mpande had once replaced Dingane. History repeats itself, right? Consequently, Cetshwayo removed the beacon and laid claim to the territory that the Swazis had previously ceded to Lydenburg, modern-day Masinching. The border had been marked in 1864, yet the Zulus maintained that, as Swazi vassals, the Swazis had no right to surrender that land. To defend the newly acquired Utrecht boundary, Cetshwayo positioned a Zulu force alongside a Boer commando, commanded by Paul Kruger for a year. North of the Pongola, the Zulu forces reclaimed their lands. The legitimacy of Zulu-signed agreements concerning the Utrecht Strip also came into question. In 1869, both factions agreed to appoint the Lieutenant Governor of Natal, Robert William Keat, as an arbitrator. But ensuing efforts to settle the dispute proved to be a complete waste of time. They usually are, aren't they? Well, although Cetshwayo disapproved of the conduct of the European missionaries, he permitted them to operate within Zululand. While a number of Christian converts were executed, no harm befell the missionaries themselves, which, of course, if any harm did, well, that would be used as certainly a justification for war. In return, some missionaries circulated negative reports. Nonetheless, Cetshwayo continued the long-standing friendly relations with the Natal colonists, even though many Zulus belonging to imposing factions fled into Natal and various adjacent areas. This was the political atmosphere by the time Cetshwayo took over the leadership of the Zulu people following his father's death in 1863. Once he was in power, he strove to reinstate the military strategies introduced by his uncle, Shaka. He formed new age-based regiments and obtained a limited supply of older muskets and other obsolete firearms for his troops. Yet most Zulu warriors still carried the traditional cowhide shield and the ikwa, a short thrusting spear similar to the assegai. Now, the spear wasn't as long as a normal spear. It was maybe, I don't know, over a meter long sort of thing. So it wasn't like this massive two-handed spear, something you would use in conjunction with those long shields. Now, the Zulu army focused intently on honing both the tactical and personal use of these weapons. Although a portion of the forces did have firearms, they were pretty poorly trained. After all, who was going to train them? And then again, they had pretty scant stocks of gunpowder and bullets, because after all, who was going to trade with them, especially in that commodity? Now, there is one summary on the Zulus' perspectives on firearms, and it goes like this. The majority of Zulu warriors would not have firearms, the arms of a coward, as they said, because they enabled the platoon to kill the brave without waiting for his attack. while tensions continued over territorial disagreements between Cetshwayo and the Transvaal. In 1877, Cetshwayo led a small contingent into Transvaal territory and managed to persuade the Boers to relinquish their independence, although Sir Theophilus Shepstone, who Cetshwayo actually regarded as an ally, had supported him in the original boundary dispute. As the Transvaal's administrator, however, Shepstone viewed the dispute from a different vantage point, and ultimately failed to present the proof he had claimed would reinforce the Boers' position. In October of 1877, during a gathering with influential Zulu figures at Blood River, Shepstone attempted to placate them with a series of paternalistic addresses. The Zulu delegates, unconvinced, charged him with treachery. While Shepstone had previously spoken highly of Cetshwayo, his subsequent communications to Lord Carnarvon began to cast the Zulu leader as a hostile menace. You see how things are kind of going off the rails here. Henry Bulwer, serving as Lieutenant Governor of Natal, now part of KwaZulu-Natal since 1875, established a commission in February of 1878 to investigate the border question. By July, the Commission's findings overwhelmingly endorsed the Zulu standpoint. Nonetheless, Sir Henry Bartle Frere, who remained committed to implementing Lord Carnarvon's Confederation scheme, dismissed the final statement as one-sided and unfair to the Boers. He also stipulated that any Boer families living on territories reassigned to the Zulu either receive compensation if they left or protection if they stayed. At the same time, Frere planned to use the Boundary Commission meeting with Zulu representatives to unveil an ultimatum he had formulated. This would empower Lord Chelmsford's British troops, previously instructed only to defend Natal if the Zulus invaded, to instead mount an offensive into Zululand. Citing 3 separate occurrences from late July, August, and September as his justification, Frere presented conditions that he knew Cetshwayo could not accept, thus setting the stage for a British attack on the Zulu Kingdom. The first 2 of these incidents involved the flight of 2 Cetshwayo Kongshon's wives into Natal and their subsequent capture and execution by Cetshwayo's brother and sons. Here is an account from the time. A wife of the chief, Cetshwayo, had left him and escaped into Natal. She was followed by a party of Zulus under Melokazulu, a chief son of Cetshwayo, and his brother seized at the kraal, where she had taken refuge and carried back to Zululand, where she was put to death in accordance with Zulu law. A week later, the same young man, with 2 other brothers and an uncle, captured in like manner another refugee wife of Cetshwayo, and in the company of a young man with whom she had fled. This woman was also carried back, and is supposed to have been put to death likewise. The young man with her, although guilty in Zulu eyes of the most heinous crime, punishable with death, was safe from them on English soil. They did not touch him. The 3rd incident happened in September, when 2 men were arrested near the Middle Drift on a sandbank of the Thukela River. These incidents alone provided pretty tenuous justifications for an invasion of Zululand. At first, Bulwer did not hold Cetshwayo accountable for the 2 women's murder and seizure, which was obviously not a political act. Additionally, Cetshwayo himself took the complaint lightly, replying, and these are the words of Cetshwayo: "Cetshwayo is sorry to have to acknowledge that the message brought to Umlungi is true, but he begs His Excellency will not take it in the light he sees the Natal government seem to do, as what Cetshwayo's sons did, he can only attribute to a rash act of boys who, in the zeal for their father's house, did not think of what they were doing. Cetshwayo acknowledges that they deserve punishing, and he sends some of his Isandlwana, who will follow Ulundi with his words. Cetshwayo states that no acts of his subjects will make him quarrel with his fathers of the house of Shaka. The initial complaint lodged with King Cetshwayo concerned a request made by the Lieutenant Governor of Natal that the individuals responsible for the offences be immediately handed over. The request was later converted to a demand by Sir Bartle Frere. Despite repeated directives from Sir Michael Hicks Beach, dated October 17th and November 21st, and December 18th, emphasizing that conflict with the Zulus must be avoided, and that a British invasion of Zululand was not permitted, Frere simply moved forward with his own plans. Keen to build a legacy, I suppose. After lengthy discussions between Frere and Sir Henry Ernest Gascoigne-Bulwer, who was then serving as Natal's Lieutenant Governor, a meeting with representatives of the Zulu King was scheduled. The purported objective of this gathering, known locally as an Indaba, was to present the long-awaited findings of the Boundary Commission to the Zulu people. However, Frere also intended to deliver an ultimatum to Cetshwayo at the same event. In addition to Cetshwayo's sons' involvement in capturing and executing two of Cetshwayo's wives, along with the assault on Smith and Dayton, there were a few other issues that justified Frere's ultimatum. Chief among them was the accusation that since his coronation in 1872, Cetshwayo had failed to honor promises supposedly made to Theophilus Shepstone. And we can't have that, can't we? In reality, that ceremony had been nothing more than a gesture to appease Shepstone, carrying no real weight among the Zulus, since Cetshwayo's councillors had already acclaimed him several weeks before his genuine Zulu investiture. Another near post hoc addition to Frere's demands called for the surrender of Mbeleni Kamswati. Banished from his native Swaziland after contesting the throne with his brother, Mbeleni had fled to Zululand and received permission from Cetshwayo to settle near the Intombe River. Likely viewed by Cetshwayo as a buffer against the Transvaal, Mbeleni established himself atop the Tafelberg, a flat-topped mountain with views of the river, and conducted raids against both Zulus and Boers, capturing cattle and prisoners in the process. When Britain annexed the Transvaal, Frere held Mbeleni's activities as evidence that the bandit operated under Cetshwayo's patronage, thus adding his extradition to the ultimatum. Frere had been accused of duplicity for exploiting the time lag in postal communications between South Africa and London to keep his superiors in the dark about what was really going on, or at least insufficiently informed. Well, his true intentions were just left, told a bit too late to intervene. He first mentioned his aim to present demands to the Zulus in a private letter to Hicks Beach on October 14, 1878. His correspondence arrived in London on November 16th, by which time the messengers had already been sent from Natal to invite Zulu representatives to the lower Tugela, as the river Tugela rather, on December 11th in order to receive the Boundary Commission's verdict. So do remember, as we said before, the British Parliament did not want another conflict. They really could not afford it. They were running out of money. Well, had Hicks responded by telegraph prohibiting any action beyond announcing the boundary statement, such a directive might have arrived in time to prevent the ultimatum. Yet since Hicks Beach had no way of perceiving the seriousness of events from Frere's vague letter, and no indications of the speed or harshness of Frere's proposed terms, it appears that really no such prohibition was issued, or perhaps could have been. Ultimately, Frere achieved his goal of provoking a conflict with the Zulus. When Cetshwayo failed to comply with the demands set on December 11th by the end of the year, Frere extended the deadline to January 11th, 1879. After that date, he quickly proclaimed a state of war. British troops originally stationed to protect Natal were already mobilized toward the Zulu frontier. Standing at the border on January 10th, they crossed into Zululand on January 11th, initiating the invasion. The ultimatum stipulations were formally communicated to Cetshwayo's envoys on December 11th, 1878, at what time came to be called the ultimatum tree on the banks of the Tugela, in the modern KwaZulu-Natal. Clauses 1 through to 3 had a 20-day window for fulfillment, ending December 31st, while Clause 4 had no specific deadline. The remaining conditions, numbered 5 through 13, were allotted an additional 10 days. The subsequent adjustment realigned all deadlines to expire on January 10th, 1879. Now, here's just a few of the stipulations. So first of all, the brother of Cetshwayo, along with 3 of his sons, must be handed over so they could be tried by Natal courts. A total of 500 head of cattle is to be imposed as penalty for the aforementioned offences and for Cetshwayo's refusal to comply with the Natal government's request that the perpetrators surrender themselves. And then there was a separate payment of 100 cattle, which was required as compensation against wrongs committed against Messrs. Smith and Dayton. There was also Umblini, a Swazi chief. They wanted his surrender, along with other individuals yet to be named, must be delivered to the Transvaal courts to face trial. All promises that were made during Cetshwayo's coronation, the one that the British witnessed, must be fulfilled, and also the men serving in Zulu forces must be granted leave to return home and the Zulu army itself completely dispersed. Of course, these are just a few of the provisions of the agreement. Now, Frere deliberately delayed notifying the colonial office about his ultimatum until it was completely impossible for them to do anything about it, thereby ensuring that officials in London would not intervene, even if they wanted to. As a result, the complete text of his demands did not arrive in the British capital until January the 2nd, 1879, and by that time, Chelmsford had already assembled an 18,000-strong force on the border of Zululand, composed of regular British redcoats, colonial volunteers, and African auxiliaries from Natal, all set to invade. Of course, the actual incursion began on January the 11th, 1879, at Rorke's Drift, once an Irish trader's post, later converted into a mission station where Chelmsford directed 4,700 soldiers of the number 3 column, comprising of 2,400 African auxiliaries and 1,900 white troops across the Buffalo River. So do remember, this isn't the Battle of Rorke's Drift. This was a little bit before that. Lord Chelmsford, the British commander-in-chief during the war, initially worried that the Zulus might evade engagement, so he devised a plan for a 5-column invasion, mobilizing more than 16,500 soldiers with the intention of encircling the Zulu forces to bring them to a decisive confrontation. Approximately 80 miles into Zulu territory lay Ulundi, the Zulu capital. After eventually deciding on 3 primary invasion columns, Chelmsford took charge of the central force, about 7,800 men, including Anthony Durnford's number 2 column and Richard Thomas Glynn's number 3 column. he established an advanced position at Helpmekar, beyond Greytown, before reaching Rorke's Drift on January the 9th, 1879. Early on January the 11th, this combined force crossed the Buffalo River into Zululand. In the meantime, Colonel Charles Pearson's No. 1 column advanced from the Tugela River's lower drift, and Colonel Evelyn Wood's No. 4 column set off from Utrecht, all converging on Ulundi. Durnford's No. 2 column was thought to remain in a defensive role near the Tugela's middle drift, just in case. While Cetshwayo's army was estimated to be at about 35,000 warriors, it functioned effectively as an on-call militia. Because they had to return to civilian duties after only a few weeks, the Zulu force's capacity for sustained operations was severely restricted. Their principal weapons were those cowhide shields, the clubs, the spears, and the assegai, specifically used for close-quarter engagements. The British columns all crossed into Zululand without opposition at first. On January the 22nd, the central column from Rorke's Drift set up camp near the rocky hill of Isandlwana. It was that morning that Lord Chelmsford split his force and went off to assist a scouting party, leaving Colonel Pullane in command of the 1,300 men of the No. 3 column who stayed behind. Later in the morning, 500 members of the No. 2 column under Colonel Durnford arrived. At the same time, the main Zulu army, approximately 20,000 strong, led by Nishingawayo Koza, outflanked the British. A diversionary Zulu contingent lured Chelmsford away to the east with most of his centre column, enabling the bulk of the Zulu force to strike the British camp directly. Chelmsford's decisions, which included disregarding clear signs of Zulu proximity and failing to fortify the camp following the established procedures, proved to be calamitous. In the ensuing Battle of Isandlwana, the Zulus achieved their greatest victory of the war. The central British column suffered devastating casualties, losing nearly all of its provisions, ammunition, and transport, while its encampment was utterly destroyed. Forced to withdraw from Zululand, Chelmsford left the area in haste. Meanwhile, on the 23rd of January, some 4,000 Zulu reserves broke away from the main army to mount an unauthorized attack on the British outpost at Rorke's Drift. After a grueling 10 hours of fighting, this Zulu assault was repelled, compelling the attackers to retreat. While the British Central Column under Lord Chelmsford was occupied elsewhere, Colonel Charles Pearson's right flank column on the coast made its own crossing of the Tugela River. Outside the Inyezane River, Pearson's forces surprised a Zulu impi attempting to ambush and subsequently pushed on to a deserted missionary station at Eshowe. Once there, they began strengthening its defenses. Learning of the disaster at Isandlwana, Pearson intended to withdraw back across the Tugela, but his supply lines were cut off before he could finalize any such plan, thus beginning the siege of Eshowe. Meanwhile, Colonel Evelyn Wood's left flank column at Utrecht had been tasked with occupying the Zulu groups located in northwestern Zululand to prevent them from interfering with the main British thrust towards Ulundi, the Zulu capital. Wood set up camp at Tinta's Kraal, about 10 miles south of Lobane Mountain, where 4,000 Zulu were reportedly spotted. He planned to attack on January 24th, but upon receiving word of the defeat at Isandlwana, he elected to pull back to the Kraal. 1 month into the invasion, only Wood's left flank column remained militarily viable, and it was as insufficient on its own to keep up a proper campaign. The British had pretty much failed in their first attempt to invade Zululand. And for the British, that is an embarrassment. But also think about it this way. Back in London, they didn't want another war, but the war was sort of launched on its own. Of course, the people who launched the war were thinking, well, we'll launch it anyway, it'll be an easy win. Bring back some goodies for the crown and, well, everyone will be very, very happy with us. The king will be very pleased. Well, not after this embarrassing defeat. Well, serves them right, I suppose. Now, from the start, Cetshwayo had intended to keep the fighting within Zulu territory, rather than invading Natal. Over the next 2 months, Chelmsford reorganized and assembled a new force, initially aiming to relieve Pearson at Eshowe. In response to the crisis, the British government dispatched 2 artillery batteries and 7 regiments of reinforcements to Natal straight away. Around March the 12th, at the Battle of Intombe, roughly 500 Zulus overwhelmed an escort protecting supplies en route to Lüneburg. The British lost all their stores, and the 80 men were killed. On March the 7th, the first reinforcements from Britain reached Durban. Lord Chelmsford, commanding a column of about 5,500 troops, that being about 2,500 African soldiers, moved out to relieve Eshowe on March 29th, constructing fortified camps each night as they advanced. Chelmsford tasked Sir Evelyn Wood with attacking the Abakhulusi Zulus entrenched at Hlobane. On March 28th, Lieutenant Colonel Redvers Buller led the assault on Hlobane. However, when the main Zulu force of 20,000 arrived to assist their besieged people, the British began a panicked withdrawal that became a rout. Approximately 1,000 Abakhulusi warriors gave chase, causing the British about 225 casualties. The following day, Wood's force of about 2,000 entrenched themselves at Kambula. Some 20,000 Zulu warriors launched an attack, possibly without Cetshwayo's approval. In the ensuing Battle of Kambula, the British held firm, and after 5 hours of intense fighting, the Zulus were forced back with heavy losses. Mounted British troops pursued them, killing many who were injured and fleeing. While the British losses amounted to 83 with 28 killed and 55 wounded, the Zulu casualties reached possibly up to 2,000. Of course, the defeat severely weakened the Zulu army, and many disheartened survivors simply returned home, despite the efforts of the commander to regroup them at Ulundi. During Wood's operations in the northwest, Chelmsford was marching on Eshowe when Zulu forces attacked his column advancing towards Ingindlovu. They were repulsed on the 2nd of April. Despite the Zulus reportedly suffering about 1,200 casualties, the British sustained only 2. But they did have 52 wounded. Not sure how wounded, but hey, it's something. Pearson's men were relieved the next day, and by April 5th, Eshowe was completely evacuated. And soon afterwards, the Zulu forces just set the entire thing on fire. For the British, this relaunched campaign, although now larger and better equipped, did not appear very promising at first. Even with victories at Kambula and Eshowe, the army still effectively found itself back in that same position at the beginning of January. Still, Chelmsford felt pretty compelled to act swiftly, hoping to crush the Zulu forces conclusively before Sir Garnet Wolseley could arrive and replace him. Reinforcements continued to pour in, pushing the total British and native strength towards 16 and 7,000 respectively. In June, having reorganized his troops, Chelmsford led a second invasion of Zululand, and this time he took extensive precautions to avoid another disaster at Isandlwana by establishing fortified camps at every stage of the advance. Prince Imperial Eugene Bonaparte, the exiled claimant to the French throne, who had volunteered for the service in the British Army, became one of the earliest British fatalities, losing his life on June the 1st while out on reconnaissance. Recognizing the newly reinforced British as formidable, Cetshwayo attempted to arrange a peace settlement, but Chelmsford refused to negotiate, driven by his determination to restore his political standing before Sir Garnet Wolseley replaced him in command. He then proceeded to the royal kraal at Ulundi, intent on defeating the main Zulu army. And, well, July the 4th, at the Battle of Ulundi, he did exactly that. Cetshwayo's forces suffered a decisive loss. And after that, Cetshwayo himself became somewhat of a fugitive. The Zulu army dispersed, and most of the principal chiefs just surrendered. Wolseley arrived to take over the final phase of operations and supersede Chelmsford. Cetshwayo was apprehended eventually on August 28th and taken to Cape Town. Accounts suggest that the king's water bearers were identified because they carried water overhead rather than resting it against their bodies. The Zulu people were officially informed that he was deposed. Wolseley quickly discarded Bartlefrere's confederation scheme, replacing it with a plan that carved Zululand into 13 separate chiefdoms run by individuals he deemed to be reliable and probably controllable, therefore ensuring future internal conflicts and preventing the Zulus from uniting again under a single monarch. So following the downfall of the Shaka dynasty, Zululand was split among 11 Zulu leaders, as well as John Robert Dunn, a European explorer, and Hulubi, a Basuto chief who had supported the British during the war. Although Chelmsford received the Knight Grand Cross of the Bath, mainly due to his success at Ulundi, the Horse Guard's subsequent investigation condemned his conduct, and he never again commanded in the field. Bartlefrere, meanwhile, was relegated to a minor post in Cape Town. Bishop John Colenso, who had championed the Zulu interests, remember him, intervened with the British authorities after the Anglo-Zulu War ended, successfully negotiating Cetshwayo's release from Robben Island and his return to Zululand in 1883. And that's not a bad ending to the story, don't you think? I suppose you didn't see that one coming. I thought they were going to hang him or something. Well, perhaps firing squad, life in prison. Well, life in prison's usually just death in prison, I suppose. Now, Melmoth Osborne was installed as a British resident to mediate between the chiefs and colonial government. When this arrangement proved to be substantial in unrest and violence, the British administration opted to actually restore Cetshwayo in 1882. That's right, getting his old job back. They gave him back his same old knife. In the meantime, however, deep hostilities had arisen between pro-royalist factions and the forces led by Zibebu and Hamu. With help from a group of white freebooters, these two chiefs inflicted serious setbacks upon the king's faction, later referred to as the Usuthu. Either way, after Cetshwayo's reinstatement, Usibepu retained control of his own territory. Meanwhile, the lands of Dun and the Basuto chief between the Tugela and the Umlazuti rivers adjoining Natal were designating a reserve intended for Zulu who declined to serve the returned monarch. This reconfigured setup proved as unworkable for Wolseley's earlier plan. Cetshwayo resented leaving Usibepu, who had built a strong and disciplined force, to act autonomously on land belonging to the royal house. Of course, conflict soon broke out. Didn't take too long. July 22nd, 1883, in fact. Accompanied by mounted Boer mercenaries, Usibepu launched a surprise attack on Cetshwayo's kraal at Ulundi, putting it to the torch and massacring anybody who was unable to get out, and that includes women and men. Although the king sustained wounds, he managed to flee to the Nkandla forest. Appealing to Melmoth Osborne, he then relocated to Eshowe, where he died not long afterwards. So, from the British perspective, the entire fiasco was considered quite a disappointment, mainly because the British incurred disproportionate losses in direct combat, despite facing an opponent that was regarded through the lens at the time as just, well, less advanced. Less advanced being the kind word for it. Completely savage being the actual written words for it that the British would have said. We read that account from before. Of course, it was common in colonial conflicts for disease to actually claim more lives in warfare, yet in this instance, battlefield casualties for the British outstripped deaths from illness by a 3-to-1 ratio, which, I suppose that's unique. Well, it's certainly something. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. We reached the end of another video. It was a bit of a unique one, wasn't it? Now, poor old Cetshwayo, huh? He was just trying to carve out a place for his people. They were pretty hard done by the Africans at that time. Talk to some Africans today. They'll tell you about it. So, let me thank my top-tier patrons, Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Legitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Video Man. I don't know why that name interests me so much. Video Man. I don't know. I think of some 90s thing, Blockbuster Video, and he's got all the technology on. I don't know. You know what I mean. People of the 90s. Then we have Ryan. We have Thor himself. Wow. We have Cameron, Stefan, and Kevin. That's right. Maybe Kevin McAllister. Never forget Kevin. Well, that is enough from me for tonight. As we just almost get to that 1 hour mark, I'm going to leave you with a little bit of ambience. And I will see you in the next exciting video. Good night, everyone. Lots of love to you all.